Welcome to The Debate. Our focus today is a really potent and, I think, contentious area of horror, the depiction of violence and psychological trauma against children. We're going to be looking at the new Stephen King prequel series, It, Welcome to Derry, which has, well, it's already got a reputation for shattering some pretty big cinematic taboos.
Yeah, and the history of horror is, it's all about pushing boundaries. It's predicated on shock. But the whole subgenre that focuses on kids, whether they're the victims or the monsters, that's uniquely fraught. For decades, there was this kind of unspoken rule in mainstream film, a line you just didn't cross when it came to killing a child, at least not graphically.
Right.
And when that rule is broken, think all the way back to Frankenstein in 1931 or the Alex Kintner death in Jaws, it doesn't just shock people. It violates this fundamental expectation of safety the audience has, and the film becomes instantly notorious for it.
And Welcome to Derry doesn't just walk up to that line. It feels like it intentionally just obliterates it in the first episode. So that brings us to our central question. Does the sheer, often really gruesome depiction of violence against children in this series serve a vital purpose, for some kind of profound social commentary? Or is it really just functioning as gratuitous boundary pushing, sort of a cynical exploitation of our most protective instincts?
My position is that while the series aims for this social critique, its commitment to maximizing the graphic spectacle often compromises that goal. It just veers a little too far into shock for shock's sake. And I think it prioritizes the intensity of the gore over the nuance of the message.
And I'm going to argue the opposite. I think this brutal approach isn't just justified, it's necessary. The horror directed at the children in Welcome to Derry is, for me, the sharpest tool the show has to dismantle this myth of 1960s white suburbia. The series is set in 1962, a time we often romanticize as idyllic and simple. But Pennywise, the entity, doesn't really create new fears, does it? It just weaponizes the societal anxieties that are already there.
You mean things like Cold War paranoia, racial segregation, that sort of thing?
Precisely. The violence isn't random. It's a visual manifestation of all that institutional rot, the racism, the militarization, and the, frankly, appalling way the community deals with mental illness. I mean, take the character of Lily Bainbridge. Her horrific scenes, like the nightmare with her father's pickled tentacles, they're just brutal metaphors for the systemic neglect and abuse people like her faced, just magnified by this supernatural entity. The horror isn't just the clown. It's the community's apathy, its isolation, that feeds this whole cycle of death.
Okay, that's a compelling reading thematically, but it makes me ask, is this level of visual depravity actually essential to get that theme across? I mean, Stephen King has used child death effectively before. Pet Sematary is the ultimate example, right? It's all about parental grief, centered on Gage's horrific death and resurrection. But Welcome to Derry sets a completely different and I think much more brutal tone right from the beginning.
How so?
It's the immediacy of it and the escalation. In the first episode, we get Maddie, a freezing 12-year-old, who takes a ride from what seems to be a safe adult and is then brutally attacked by this demon spawn thing. And it doesn't even stop there. It culminates almost right away in the Capitol Theater massacre. Here you have three distinct kids, Phil, Teddy, and Susie, graphically murdered by that same creature. This isn't just killing one kid to establish a threat, like in Jaws. This is a sustained, calculated choice to maximize gore. It establishes from the jump that the show will sacrifice children not just for stakes, but for spectacle. And that's where it risks becoming sensationalism.
But that intense, immediate start is fundamental. By hitting us with that carnage right away, the show denies the audience that comfort we get from typical horror tropes, where the kids are protected or it's only minor characters who die. Derry is presented as a systemically poisoned place. The show has to tell us up front the stakes are real, the terror is everywhere, and that sense of safety you expect for the main characters, it just doesn't exist here.
I see why you'd argue for the necessity of that immediacy, but let's just look at how child death has functioned historically in horror. We've had shocking moments before, the kid getting crushed in Final Destination 2, or the bugs coming out of the kid's head in Halloween 3. But those were brief. They were surgical shocks. In Derry, The focus seems to be on crafting these really complex, drawn-out, gruesome sequences.
And why do you think that level of detail is a problem?
Because the specificity of the gruesomeness often feels like it's designed just to one-up the last big horror movie. It feels less about illustrating the rot of the 1960s and more about delivering the scariest and most shocking moment possible. Does the social commentary about racism really need the full, explicit visual of a child being torn apart by a demonic baby? I'm just arguing that the message could land just as forcefully without tipping so far into excessive sensationalism.
I counter that in Derry, those graphic deaths are actually intrinsically linked to the whole thematic infrastructure of the town, especially its political rot. The horror isn't random. Look at the Black Spot Fire. General Shaw uses the entity to orchestrate events so he can seize control of Derry with Operation Precept, this military mechanism for surveillance and control. So the deaths of children like Rich at the Black Spot or the kids at the Capitol Theater, they literally become the fuel for militarization and political power. Their suffering is essential because it shows the rot is institutional, not just supernatural.
Okay, you're defining Operation Precept as the source of that rot. I still struggle to see how those political plans demand that specific degree of graphic detail when the children are killed. It really seems like the creators just decided they needed to subvert our expectations at every single turn, which brings us to the next point, really breaking that whole ensemble trope.
And I absolutely defend that decision, especially with the Capitol Theater massacre. We're so conditioned by shows like Stranger Things, right? We know the core group of kids is going to make it through the season no matter what. Derry just throws that out the window immediately. It shows that these young characters are genuinely disposable puzzle pieces in the town's history. The terror isn't about one group of losers, it's systemic. It shows the community itself is toxic and is literally consuming its own children. That move is vital to reinforce how pervasive Pennywise's influence really is.
I understand the impulse to show systemic terror by sacrificing the ensemble, but that move can be, I think, narratively self-defeating. When a show kills its youngest, most relatable characters with such brutal abandon, what happens to the audience's willingness to invest? That ensemble trope, yeah, it's predictable, but it gives us emotional anchors. By ripping them away so graphically, the show risks creating emotional distance, where subsequent deaths just become technical exercises in visual horror instead of profound emotional events that are linked to these social failures you're talking about.
I disagree that it creates distance. I think it forces a kind of hypervigilance. It focuses our horror less on losing an individual character and more on the horrifying realization that the adults, the politicians, the military, the parents, are the ones responsible for the environment that allows this to happen. The shock isn't the death itself, it's the system that permitted it.
But even the critics focused on the spectacle. They highlighted scenes like Marge cutting her eye out after turning into a slug, or Pennywise using the principal as a meat puppet. My concern is just that the desire to prove no one is safe justified shifting the focus almost entirely to maximizing gruesome effects, and in doing so it overshadowed the very social commentary that you're championing.
Well, this is Stephen King's universe, and his tradition is all about pushing parental and community failure to their absolute limits. The creators chose the 1960s specifically to amplify that vulnerability. The physical horror is simply the final, logical consequence of that systemic rot.
Let's pivot to the psychological part, which is just as brutal. This brings up my third point, the role of the child as victim versus monster. When a child becomes the monster, like Gage in Pet Sematary, or even Charlie in Hereditary, the horror works on a different level. It's arguably less exploitative because the trauma is inflicted by the child, or at least through them.
And Derry focuses almost completely on the child as a helpless victim of both.
Exactly. We see scene after scene of Pennywise psychologically torturing individual kids, exploiting their existing trauma. You have Ronnie Groeming's horrific birth nightmare, Will's waking nightmare being dragged by his charred father, and of course Lily Bainbridge's ordeal. Is this intense, sustained focus on shattering the psyche of the most defenseless characters truly illuminating? Or is it just using their absolute vulnerability for guaranteed audience distress? It feels like using a child's fragility as a shock multiplier.
That guaranteed distress is the point, and it's not arbitrary. It forces the audience to feel the specific pain of that systemic cruelty. You mentioned Lily Bainbridge, which is a perfect example. Her character embodies how women with mental health struggles in the 1960s were just pathologized, treated as hysterical, threatened with being locked away. The psychological torture Pennywise puts her through is a magnified, supernatural reflection of the real-world neglect and emotional abuse she was already suffering from her ideal 1960s family.
I'll grant you the thematic tie is strong, but the visual manifestation of that abuse, the pickled tentacles, the graphic nature of it, it often pushes the viewer away from the metaphor and just towards simple repulsion. We watch horror to confront our fears safely, but when the content is this relentlessly focused on the systematic, graphic victimization of children, that safe distance we need for reflection, it collapses. It just becomes a spectacle of suffering.
But the series operates on the principle that the failure of the adults is so profound, so institutional, that the terror must push the outer limits of what we're prepared to accept. If the violence were toned down, it would imply that the institutional negligence was somehow manageable. By making it hyper-extreme, the series argues that the rot is absolute.
I am just not convinced that absolute rot requires absolute gore. The very first scenes with the 12-year-old being attacked and then a demon baby killing 3 children, that sets a metric for graphic violence that suggests the highest priority is just pure shock. And that fundamentally shifts how we consume the material. We move from analyzing social critique to simply measuring how brutal the next scene is going to be. And that, I would argue, degrades the intellectual merit of the series.
I maintain that the extreme, unsparing nature of the violence in Welcome to Derry is a bold and I think necessary mechanism. It ensures the series achieves its goal, forcing us to look directly at the deep institutional failure hidden beneath that quaint small-town facade. The grotesqueness is simply the required, unfiltered visual language of that sickness.
And I maintain that while the creators were clearly aiming for profound social commentary, the decision to relentlessly crank up the volume on gruesome violence against its most vulnerable characters risks collapsing the series into just very effective shock horror. The persistent focus on spectacular brutality, for me, diminishes the nuance of the social critique, leaving the intensity of the violence as the main takeaway.
So we're left with that eternal paradox of the horror genre then, from the earliest cinematic taboos about child death in Frankenstein all the way to the brutally graphic scenes in Welcome to Derry. The genre is continually testing the boundaries of acceptable violence, forcing audiences to confront not just their fears, but their own tolerance for viewing the unthinkable.
A confrontation that only becomes more intellectually challenging as creators strive to make each new thing more shocking than the last. There's a lot more to unpack about where that line of narrative necessity really lies.
A truly thoughtful exchange. We appreciate you joining us for the debate.